Hi, everybody, and welcome to our second episode in the ECOWind Policy Masterclass series. I'm just going to wait a couple of minutes just to make sure we've got everybody. I will start at 3 minutes past, I think. Today, we're going to be talking about strategic compensation, just a bit of housekeeping before we start. At the end, we're going to have a panel discussion and then the opportunity for questions. During the talk, if you could put any questions you've got in the Q&A box at the top, that would be great. And then we can gather them for the end. And we will start in 1 minute, just give the opportunity for any latecomers to arrive. I should also say that we're going to be recording this and the recording will be going up on the ECOWind website, so we can share it with your colleagues and anybody that didn't attend today. Still getting a few people in, so I think I will just give it a minute before we start. Okay, I think we've waited enough. Okay, so last time we met, we talked about Kim gave us a general overview of policy associated with offshore wind and some of the challenges and conflicts and synergies that exist with that. Today, we're going to talk about strategic compensation. But before we go on to that, I just want to give everybody a quick overview of what we have coming up. On the 29th of May, Ed Wilsteed from HMC is going to be giving a masterclass on cumulative impact assessment, which is going to draw on some recent work that we've been doing for JNCC across all of the marine management bodies in the UK. And then later on over the summer, we'll be giving talks on marine net gain, marine spatial planning, natural capital, fisheries policy and marine monitoring. So yes, we've got lots of good stuff to come. But today is going to be all about strategic compensation. So what we're going to go through is I'm going to give you a presentation on strategic compensation, which will take about 20 minutes. We're then going to have a panel discussion with me and Ed and Kim, all of whom are working on various aspects of this across various bits of government and industry and the research community at the moment. And then we'll have about 20 minutes for Q&A at the end as well. So without further ado, the question that we hope to answer today for you is, what is strategic compensation? And I'm going to start this from really first principles in the kind of understanding that actually what goes on in government and policy and planning and consenting can be quite arcane to those of you that aren't involved in it every day. There's a lot of jargon, there's a lot of assumed knowledge, and what I want to do today is just start from first principles to make sure that we're all operating from the same sort of set of principles. So strategic compensation relates to compensation under the habitats regulations. So the habitats regulations originally came from the Habitats Directive, which is a European directive, and have since been transposed into UK law. And the habitats regulations allow for the designation of two types of marine protected areas: special protection areas, which are species. So that's mainly at sea. You're talking about birds and marine mammals. And special areas of conservation, which are habitats. And in marine, we're again mainly talking about sandbanks, but also things like seagrass and some various other benthic habitats. But it's mainly benthic ecology we're talking about. So importantly, what we're not talking about here is we're not talking about marine conservation zones, which are marine protected areas that are set up under the Marine and Coastal Access Act. And the importance about that is that the habitats regulations have some quite strict rules about how you do and don't do activity in that site, which we're going to talk about. And marine conservation zones, the rules are slightly less strict. They're still quite strict, but they're slightly less strict, and they're dealt with in a different way, which is why we're not going to be including them in this conversation. Similarly, we're not talking about highly protected marine areas either, and highly protected marine areas are areas where there's effectively no human activity allowed, and in English waters those are similarly designated as highly protected marine conservation zones rather than highly protected SACs or SPAs. It's quite complicated. We've only just started and already we're getting into lots of different acronyms, but just to be clear, that what we're talking about here is special protection areas and special areas of conservation under the habitats regulations. So these are areas that have been designated for features, whether those features are kittiwakes or harbour porpoise or sandbanks or seagrass or chalk reef. They've been designated for features, and when someone wants to either carry out a project within those sites or put in place a statutory plan that might affect those sites, so the type of thing we'll talk about there is a marine plan or a offshore wind leasing round, they have to pass these tests that are on the screen here. First of all, you have to assess whether your activity is going to have a likely significant effect on the integrity of that site. So what that means is you look at the features within that site and you figure out, are you going to have a likely significant effect on it? And there are lots of precedent and case law around what likely significant effect means. Effectively, that's a screening exercise. If it is yes, then you need to do a more detailed assessment of, are you going to have an adverse effect on the integrity of that site, which is effectively a significant impact? If the answer to that is, I am going to have an adverse effect on the integrity of the site, and actually you see the wording here starts to get a bit tricky. So the test is, can you prove that there is no adverse effect on the integrity of the site? And if you can't prove that, you then have to go through these next tests in stepwise order. So first of all, you have to prove that there are no alternative solutions to what you are about to do, which is often a difficult test to prove. If you are looking at something like HS2, for example, proving that alternative solutions test was quite integral to how they did the habitats regs assessment of that site. But you can also imagine that if you've got things like a deep water container terminal or an offshore wind farm at sea, that alternative solutions of where you might be able to go to meet the objective that you are trying to meet can become quite complicated. If you could demonstrate that where you're going is the only place that you can go, you then need to show that you've got imperative reasons of overriding public interest, which effectively is the base case for that is that what you are doing is set out in national level policy and is a requirement for the UK. And so you'll see often things like offshore wind farms, but also things like HS2 being able to prove that because they are set out either in law or in government policy of some sort. So if you can prove that, you then need to provide compensation. And what we're going to talk about a bit is what that compensation looks like and what it should be. But essentially, you need to be able to demonstrate that your project hits no net loss in whatever way you're putting that package together. So, for example, if I'm going to have an impact on a sandbank within a designated site and I can't mitigate that effect on site, I need to look at other ways of trying to offset that effect either on site or outside site. And there are, again, lots of case law about how that can and can't be done. So why has this become important right now? The UK offshore wind pipeline is big and is moving at pace. We've identified that we need 78 gigawatts of capacity to hit our net zero targets. We've got 32 gigawatts of capacity yet to be identified to reach that 2050 target. And we've currently got running round 4, round 5, There is a capacity increase round that the Crown Estate's looking at, which is to increase capacity on existing sites. And then in Scotland, there's ECOWind and INTOG. So there is a lot of pressure on our marine environment, and particularly for fixed offshore wind. A lot of the places where it's good to build, i.e. relatively shallow water, are also good for biodiversity and are designated sites. So there is increasingly crossover between where people want to develop and where we have designated sites. So we need to provide compensation. And previously that compensation had been provided on a project by project basis. So projects will be coming in and saying, we want to develop in a particular place. We're going to have impacts that can't be mitigated on birds or on benthic, which is the ones that are coming forward most often, and they're trying to deal with those on their own. And what they're finding is that increasingly that's getting more and more difficult to do. And so they're looking to strategic options. And so I'm just going to talk a little bit about how strategic compensation is different from normal compensation. So in terms of a delivery model, strategic compensation is often done at across multiple developers. So it's lots of developers who are all going to have similar impacts operating at the same time. So either lots of developers working together or a third party who may come forward and say, I'm going to develop a measure that can then meet the needs of multiple people. What that then means is that you have funding that is joined up. So funding that's joined up from multiple developers, sometimes funding that's joined up from multiple developers, and other parties, potentially public bodies, but mainly from developers. Scale is a really important one. When we're talking about project level compensation, you'll be looking within the footprint of that project. When you're looking at strategic compensation, we'll be looking at large biogeographic areas. And the ability to deliver at scale means that you can do things in a more cost-effective way, but also in a way that is more ecologically sensible. Compliance. So the way that you do compliance on a individual project is quite straightforward. You have a developer who has a development consent order or a license, and within it there are conditions that they have to do particular things. When we're looking at compliance across multiple operators who are all drawing down from the same compensation measure, that issue of compliance becomes much more difficult, because trying to understand how you attribute that compensation to different developers is something that we're still working through. DEFRA ran a piece of work last year that we helped them with, looking at how do we try and get some of those principles of how strategic compensation is different from normal compensation down on paper. And we came up with these 7 principles in consultation with operators and NGOs and government community. And I think that the important thing from this is that strategic compensation sometimes isn't different from normal compensation, and it's as important to identify where there are similarities as to where there are differences. So to run through these, strategic compensation should address established and emerging impacts that will be more effectively compensated for across multiple projects, either at a plan level or through strategic environmental assessment. So a really good example of this is the round 4 Crown Estate's round 4 habitats regulations assessment in relation to their round 4 leasing plan. They have produced strategic compensation plans for kittiwakes and for benthic impacts on Dogger Bank, which I'm going to talk about later. Those were identified at a strategic level and can be used by the projects within that leasing round. Strategic compensation measures should apply the same preference hierarchy as project level compensation measures, and I'm going to talk about that in a bit more detail in a moment. Strategic compensation measures should be scientifically and ecologically robust prior to inclusion in the library of measures. So DEFRA are building up this library of measures, which I'm going to talk about in a moment. This is a really key point because developing measures at this scale, currently there is quite a lot of innovation. There's quite a lot of people trying new things. And there is quite a lot of discussion at the moment about whether those innovative pilots should be allowed to go forward as statutorily required measures to provide compensation, given the amount of uncertainty there is around them. Strategic compensation measures should look to deliver as much environmental benefit as possible. So this is about over-delivering as much as possible. So if I'm putting a measure forward, that I am putting that measure out once, and that measure can then be drawn down on by multiple operators over a period of time. Principle 5 is a bit like principle 3. It shouldn't just be scientifically and ecologically robust. It must be technically feasible. You must be able to do it, and you must be able to have a plausible delivery approach. Strategic compensation measures can align with broader conservation measures. So this is a principle about a thing called additionality, where compensation shouldn't be used to basically for the private sector to fund what government should be doing in terms of developing measures for MPAs. What this principle says is that whilst it agrees with that principle of additionality, they should align wherever possible with those existing management activities. And strategic compensation at the moment is focused on responding to offshore wind, but shouldn't be exclusive to this sector, as other sectors might be able to be used in the future. So this preference hierarchy that we're talking about is that when we're developing a measure, we should be looking at, for preference, the same feature at the same location. If you can't deliver that, we should be looking at the same ecological function at the same location. If we can't deliver that, we should be looking at comparable ecological function at the same location. And if we can't deliver that, a comparable ecological function at a different location. This is different to providing nature positive operations or marine net gain or environmental restoration, because compensation has a grounding in law, which means that you need to be looking at the ecological function of our MPA network. And to do that, there is an acknowledgement that if a feature is being damaged, that feature should be being replaced, or at the very minimum, another feature that has a comparable ecological function should be being delivered for that compensation. So what measures are being considered? Mainly it's around birds and benthic habitats, and I'm going to get into a bit more detail on this. But when we're looking at birds, it's things like prey availability. So how do we increase the prey that birds feed on? And that's mainly through fisheries management. Predator eradication, and that's mainly onshore, onshore nesting, and then nesting sites offshore. So a lot of these artificial towers that are currently being built for Kittiwake, and we'll talk about those in a moment. Benthic habitats, we're mostly talking about either benthic restoration, extension of MPAs. So this is particularly considered for sandbanks, which are very difficult to restore or create, but you can protect. And then either infrastructure removal, so this is extant infrastructure, mainly oil and gas, taking it out to remove that footprint, or conversely, keeping it in to create additional hard benthic habitat. And both those options have people who think that they are the best thing to do, and I don't think there is a clear view on that at the moment. So just a few slides on some of the stuff that's going on at the moment. DEFRA is developing a library of measures, which is effectively a piece of work to determine measures that meet all those criteria we talked about earlier and are kind of pre-approved effectively. So developers can choose a strategic measure from that library ahead of submitting their consent application, which means that they don't have to go through the long drawn out process of making sure that that individual measure is agreed by all the people that need to agree it, but that's done ahead of time. So that gives those operators greater certainty that both the measures are available, so that the likelihood of them being able to get consent goes forward, and also reduces the time to discuss options during examination, and theoretically make sure that the measures with the greatest ecological benefit are taken forward. So that DEFRA library of measures is in quite early days. The first measures that have gone in there are looking at predator reduction or eradication for seabirds, artificial nesting towers, which you can see in the bottom right there, for kittiwakes in the English North Sea, and designation of additional MPAs for benthic habitats. And in a moment, I'll talk about exactly where they have been used within the statutory process. So alongside that DEFRA work, the Offshore Wind Industry Council, which is a industry body representing most of the operators, is running strategic compensation pilots. These are delivering evidence on best practice for offshore wind compensation across these areas here, and you can see that a lot of those line up with the previous work I've talked about from DEFRA. Scottish Government has been doing some work looking at potential seabird compensation measures, and again you can see some of the actions here. I'm not going to go into them in a lot of detail because we're repeating a lot of what we said previously, but there has been a lot of consideration about what people think could work and how it could work. And finally, in terms of sort of pilot work, there has been this developer-led study on ornithology, which looked at non-like-for-like measures. So if you remember that preference hierarchy we were talking about earlier, if you're going to get to a point where you say, actually, we can't deliver compensation on a particular bird species, then what do we do in that instance? And again, that they've looked at various different measures that are considered in detail. I think the important thing to note about this, oh, wait 1 minute, it is that their conclusions that came out were that actually the amount of offshore wind that we want to deliver, it's likely that we're going to need to try and do this, and we need to try and take an approach that maximizes the efficacy of the measures that you're putting in place and the long-term benefit of them, but also has a look, can provide that certainty that measures are available, and tries to reduce the competition between developers for measures. This works, again, really interesting, not least because it's come out of industry. Whilst DEFRA have made it really clear that compensation needs to be delivered, has to be within the preference hierarchy they've talked about, and something that is non-like for like won't be accepted. So, for example, you wouldn't be able to deliver seagrass for sandbank because it's just too far away from each other. The last couple of slides here are some examples of where strategic compensation has been used. So the Kittiwake Strategic Compensation Plan, which came out in February from the Crown Estate, and the web links at the bottom there, they've looked at management of fisheries, offshore artificial nesting structures and habitat creation, and I would recommend you go and have a look at that to see how they've been articulated. Just recently, so in the last week or so, the Crown Estate have also released their Dogger Bank Strategic Compensation Plan, and you can see here the preferences they've got here are site extension or designation, restriction of fishing, and seagrass restoration, and that's to compensate for benthic impacts. So the lessons that we've learnt going through this process, and it's been quite an intense process because the offshore wind deployment timetable is fast and getting faster, is that compensation on a project by project basis is getting difficult to find. And I would go as far to say the days are probably fairly numbered that an individual project will be able to go into an examination and get compensation as an individual project. Many approaches are not mature, and certainty over ecosystem function needs to be improved to make sure that the measures we're putting in place are real. And that's particularly for things like prey reduction, which requires a good understanding of ecosystem function, but also something as simple as nesting towers, because understanding productivity and how that feeds in to population increase is really, really important. And also these measures can be costly. So putting those nesting towers up costs tens of millions of pounds. MPA designation can only be done by government, and fisheries management measures. There are lots of issues around that, not least how the fishing industry are treated fairly in that process. So as we always get to at the end of these discussions, how can the research community help? So there's lots of things that you can do. You can help scope options, you can help provide evidence of outcomes, you can help provide site-specific data and evidence, you can help build knowledge and expertise in the offshore wind industry and in government, and you can help enhance that intergovernmental collaboration. Actually, the people who are working across different agencies and across different administrations, it's really important that when you're doing that, you're joining those gaps, because they aren't always as well joined up as we'd like to think they are. And some of those key evidence gaps that we've got there of understanding how to deploy these measures and the success of these measures is really important. And I'm not going to go through those again because we've talked about them a lot. But there are some big evidence gaps that are worth exploring in there. And I will say this in every one of our masterclasses, but I would recommend you go and have a look at the Offshore Wind Environmental Evidence Register, or OWER, which has a list of those evidence gaps. Now, I want to give enough time for us to have a discussion, and also for to take any questions that may come from the floor. So I'm going to flash this screen up, and then I am going to take it down so we can have a discussion. We don't actually have Henk with us today, unfortunately, but who we do have is myself. And I'm one of the co-champions of the ECOWind EcoFlow Insight programs, and a director here at HMC. I've got Ed, who's associate director at HMC and a fisheries policy, marine and fisheries policy specialist, so he does a lot of work on cumulative effects assessment, as well as fisheries management. And Kim, who's got a background in offshore wind consenting, and helps run a lot of our offshore wind work here at HMC. So what I'm just going to do is stop sharing my screen if I can. And then let me just do this. Spotlight us for everyone so that everyone can see us. Sorry, Ed, you're going to be there on your own for a minute. Okay, great. So, okay. That was quite a canter through stuff, and we've got a couple of questions here before we take questions from the floor. The first one is, hopefully we've covered a lot of, but I'd just be really interested to get your views on. Ed, what do you see as the main benefit of compensating strategically rather than on a project basis?
Yeah, thanks, Dickon. It's the fact that we can do it at scale, I think, and the fact that in theory it should be sort of like brought forward, so hopefully should alleviate some of those consenting delays that have been happening on a project by project basis. Looking at sort of my history with EIAs and looking at cumulative effects assessment, I think it was always sort of blindingly clear to people that trying to assess impacts on various protected species or habitats, whatever it might have been, doing that on a project by project basis was not effective, is not effective. And I think this is sort of like a significant step in allowing meaningful compensation in theory to happen. But yeah, I'm sure as we'll get on to, there's going to be all sorts of challenges to actually sort of enable that to happen. But it's that movement, it's that move to scale.
Yeah. Kim, I don't know if you've got a view on that as well. Like, what are the main benefits of compensating strategically?
Yeah, just to add that it is the only way forward, really. It kind of has to happen in order to smooth the consenting process. Like you said, it's just getting really hard to deliver compensation at project level. But I do think the benefit of doing it strategically will be that there'll be a forward-looking view to make sure that all impacts are being appropriately compensated for. And that forward-looking approach will also help us think of impacts that are going to come down the line, as well as with climate change and just things changing in general.
Is there an interesting point as well about getting the most ecologically successful approach, but also the one that is the most cost and time effective? And I know in a previous life, Kim, you used to do a lot of consenting, and it feels like we're getting to a point with compensation measures, that they are becoming prohibitively expensive for one operator to deliver on their own.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's right. And I think we've actually even seen the Norfolk projects that Vattenfall had not taken forward because they couldn't, partly because they couldn't deliver the compensation measures, or that they were too expensive. So yeah, which brings us neatly onto our next question of, what do you think, and then I'm going to come to you first again, what do you think the main challenges are of this approach?
Yeah, I think there's sort of like different ways you can look at it. Some of them are sort of conceptual issues that very much relate to sort of understanding how you actually sort of deal with some of those uncertainties, bringing that information from sort of scientific progress into that sort of decision making. And I think it's very much about making sure you've got that enabling environment set up so that the science community knows what it's sort of trying to support in terms of those questions that people at the sort of decision making end are going to have. The other thing which I kind of find fascinating about this and thinking it through is so this is being done for offshore wind, but there are, as Kimberly mentioned, you've got sort of climate change going on, you've got all these other sorts of issues happening across different sectors. And I think there's also an interesting question there about, can you disentangle this, or should you try and sort of bring things together across those different sectors? So thinking about seabirds being impacted by disease, being impacted by prey availability due to competition with fisheries, as well as sort of the potential sort of turbine impacts going on there. So yeah, there's definitely something around the knowledge and how we bring that knowledge into the decision making. And then there's something as well, which is more conceptual, I think, about how can we actually extend this out so that we're really looking at what's going on, just using seabirds as an example, but that sort of that cumulative picture for seabirds.
Kim, if you've got anything you'd like to add to that, or even some new points on the main challenges of compensating strategically.
Yeah, kind of going off from a bit that Ed said, is the evidence. There's a lot of evidence gaps of, we don't know if these compensation measures are going to work ecologically, or what's the benefits, or what impacts they might have. And with us having to work so fast, we do need a way of making sure that the newest evidence is being translated straight into some sort of guidance and being uptaken like in a different way than what's happened previously.
It's a really important point, that, and I'll give a nod towards the Crown Estates Offshore Wind Evidence and Knowledge Hub, which is trying to set themselves up to do exactly that, but is still in sort of fairly nascent, I think. We've got go on, Ed, sorry.
So yeah, I was just going to add one thing. I think the other thing that this sort of like flags up is just the importance of the collaborative approach. So more about that sort of delivery end of this and sort of bringing all of that together. There's such an important piece there across, because this is sort of breaking new ground. It's something where government is key. It's something where the science community is key. It's something where the industry itself is key, and probably some other sectors as well. And then, of course, you've got the transboundary element where you've got sort of migratory birds that are spanning all those different jurisdictional boundaries too. So there's all sorts of sort of delivery challenges that get thrown up by this approach as well.
Yeah. There's an interesting question in the chat, which I'm going to go to, from Julie Black, who says, can you say something about the obligation to monitor the effectiveness of measures, please? And who is responsible, what's required, and how is effectiveness measured? And just to kick us off there, so that obligation to monitor the effectiveness sits with whoever has the liability for that measure. And the reason why I say that in a slightly sort of vague way is that if it was project level compensation, that liability would sit on a consent, as a condition of a consent with an operator, and they would have to report on a set basis against ecological success criteria. And those ecological success criteria should be pretty nailed down to the methodology that you're using. And that can be different across whether you're looking at benthic or whether you're looking at birds or whatever that might be. But those ecological success criteria are a key part of designing any compensation measure. The reason why I said whoever has that liability is that there is a thing called the Marine Recovery Fund, which was allowed for in the Energy Security Act, which allows for a third party to develop compensation measures and be responsible for their delivery. Who that third party is and how they operate hasn't yet been determined, and DEFRA is working that through at the moment. But the issue of liability associated with effectiveness and how that effectiveness is measured then sits with that third party rather than the operator. So that gives another kind of layer of complexity to things. Yeah, it's interesting if you go and look at the Crown Estate's strategic compensation plans. They've got sections on monitoring effectiveness and compliance that are worth having a look at. Ed, Kim, I don't know if you've got anything you want to add to that.
The only thing I think is just, again, it sort of like spans different pieces, but just the sort of the tools that are needed to get that monitoring, and just thinking about some of those interesting sort of science questions about demonstrating impact, about what do you actually need, what are the tools that you need, what's the data that you need to look at the effectiveness of these measures. I think there's a lot of uncertainties there as well, and we're seeing that in lots of sort of work across sort of monitoring, evaluation, and learning in general. That there are also scientific questions mixed in there about how to sort of improve the way that we monitor things.
Yeah, there's a really interesting question from Rosamund Green in the chat saying, is not building ever discussed as a mitigation or compensation option? The overall discussion in this sector is that marine development will happen, and we just have to find ways to make that okay for nature. Does the compensation discussion ever look at alternative means of renewable energy generation to buy us time to understand the impact on the marine environment, i.e. rather than building a new offshore wind farm, use that money to put solar panels all over industrial car parks instead? So what's really important to understand is the different levels of decision making that go on in government. At the highest level, you've got national policy statements that themselves have to have habitats regulations assessments done against them because they count as plans in the broadest sense. So we have national policy statements for renewable energy that enshrine in national policy the targets that we have for offshore wind as opposed to solar, as opposed to any other form of renewable energy. And once that's put in national policy, then when you get to a project level, if you are contributing to that policy target, you can't open up that discussion again about whether you should have offshore wind or solar. And there might be reasons where you might want to open that discussion, and it might make sense to, but the reason that happens is because you can't, in every single project level examination, you can't reopen those large government policy targets, because it would make life too chaotic. Those national policy statements are renewed regularly. I want to say every 3 or 4 years, but it's likely that it'll all be reviewed if we have a new administration, for example, come in. And at that time, there's a consultation process that it's possible to input to. But yeah, generally, you can't go back and look at that. So when you're looking at the no alternatives option, you're looking at what are the alternatives to delivering 50 gigawatts of offshore wind by a particular date. And yeah, that's the target you have to go to. Otherwise, the sands shift underneath you all the time. Ed, I'm going to come to you now, because Mike has, and we've had lots of conversations with Mike Heath about this, and Mike from Strathclyde has talked about the elephant in the room. The elephant in the room is fisheries. Clearly, fisheries have a huge effect on the ecosystem, but both the UK and Scottish governments seem very reluctant for them to be involved in compensation, e.g. Sea Response to consultation on MNG. How do we overcome this barrier to progress? And there's some important stuff about a just transition and fairness and all that kind of stuff that would be interesting to hear you talk about, Ed, because you're really knowledgeable on this.
Yeah, thanks. And yeah, it's a fascinating question. I think one of the starting points actually is to have a sort of like a proper understanding of what's going on for the fishing industry at the moment. And as you mentioned, Dickon, around this just transition piece, that there's something there where there's a fascinating study in the Netherlands at the moment where people were asking fishing vessel owners whether or not they felt that their livelihood, their source of employment, their means of earning a living was actually a legitimate livelihood. And something like 40% of the people felt that, because of the way conservation measures are being implemented, because of the way that there's this squeeze going on, the spatial squeeze, that they felt that it was no longer legitimate, which I find startling. That you've got people from sort of, generations who've been going to sea and all the rest of it. And many of these people see that this is a livelihood and that they're also contributing to food security. And I know that there's all sorts of things, say, around sand eel and the supply of fish meal and things like that, which is going into sort of like non-human consumption kinds of sources. But I think what this really shines a spotlight on, and the way to kind of get forward, is that there does need to be some sort of like, number one, sort of like a proper understanding of what's actually going on from a fisheries perspective, in terms of spatial squeeze and everything else, and setting that out within some form of strategy. Yeah, and then the second part is bringing people to the table, having those discussions. At the moment, that it's obviously a really heated topic, and I think there are many reasons why it's heated. And part of it is from a fisheries perspective, this kind of incremental chipping away of access to fishing grounds and the availability of species and so on. So I think there's a really strong argument for, one, understanding the overall picture, and number two, getting people around the table, having those discussions, recognizing that they're going to be very challenging, and if necessary, having those discussions around a just transition. How do you actually have a fair social outcome for the people who are going to be impacted by big policy decisions around sort of the industrialization of large areas of the sea?
Yeah, thanks, Ed. It's not an easy, there's no easy answer to that, I don't think, is there? Other than just making sure that we keep communicating and keep talking. Karima has made a point here where she's interested in the thoughts on the involvement of other industries in strategic compensation. And this is their first question. And the second question is, there's a lot of focus on strategic compensation now, but does more need to be done to avoid getting to that point? So that's about designing out impact as we go in the process. So Kim, I don't know if you've got any thoughts on either the involvement of other industries or whether we can do more to design impact out as we go.
I definitely think we do need to be doing more in the design phase, and all of our ECOWind projects are really looking to build some of that evidence around mitigation, which is really, really useful, and will be valuable. I'm not sure about getting other industries involved. It just feels so complex at the moment. It's kind of like, can we just take a breath and get this right first? But I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
So I kind of agree with you, to be honest. I think that whilst other industries might benefit from it, there is nothing like the scale of offshore wind at the moment. And it's like as Ed you called it, the industrialization of our seas that's all happening over a decade. And yeah, it does need that focus on offshore wind. So the other thing I think about what more can be done to avoid getting to that point is about having good cumulative effects assessment, and we're going to talk about that in the next one. But understanding what those cumulative effects are up front when you're planning is really important to avoid too much compensation being needed at a project level. Ed, I don't know if you've got anything you want to add on to that.
Yeah, I'm sort of torn on this one, because there's part where I've sort of got that the pragmatist hat, which I'd very much say yes, this is already sort of charging on and agreeing with what you were saying, Kim, about trying to understand how this strategic compensation can actually be rolled out for offshore wind alone, and it is significant, so that would be a real milestone anyway. And then there's a sort of like the science hat, which kind of goes on and thinking about that cumulative effects kind of approach. And one of the kind of like the critical points, I guess, of good cumulative effects assessment is that you put whatever you care about at the middle of that assessment. So you put that sort of receptor or valued component, whatever you want to call it, you put that at the center and you look at all the things which are impacting on it at this point in time. And undoubtedly there's lots of sort of other activities which are going on which could be managed and which are sort of having an effect as well. So there's that sort of challenge between the sort of like the pragmatic, let's make some progress like hat, and the other one of just we need to understand what's going on from the receptor's perspective.
Yeah. In the absence of another question, I'm going to ask you both a question, which we could probably talk for ages about, but we've only got maybe 5 minutes. One of the challenges with a lot of what we've been talking about is that we're working right at the very edge of what science can tell us. And there's a real sort of issue about how do you combine innovation and new science with the rigor needed for regulation. So there's a question around how do you avoid complete paralysis because of the uncertainty around it. And I don't know, Ed, I'm going to come to you first on that, I think.
Yeah, I think management paralysis is one of our sort of long-standing kinds of issues in terms of making progress, because every time you start studying something, 1,000 other questions pop up. We're never going to kind of get to the point of scientific certainty. So for me, it's very much about adopting sort of proper sort of risk-based approaches and making sure that you've got adaptiveness and flexibility built into those. I'm not sure quite how well built in those are at the moment in terms of our sort of like regulatory and decision-making processes. I think it's quite challenging for regulators. I think it's also really challenging for the people who are investing in this environment and in those offshore wind sort of developments, because from an investor perspective, certainty is good and uncertainty is not. But yeah, I think again it's one of these ones that comes down to that collaboration and trying to really set in place kind of like a strong kind of framework and principles for everything to operate around, and then to sort of try to the part that's still there is how do you then accommodate the sort of like the uncertainty in the political dimension, which is really challenging as well. But I think it's very much about sort of like how do we actually make some progress on the enabling environment, the principles, the framework, and making that as adaptive as possible.
Yeah. Kim, have you got any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think we keep on saying that, we need to bring policy and science together, and we can keep on saying it, but it feels like we need more of it. We just always need further sort of collaboration and just continuous engagement of getting to the point where just lay out all the evidence that we have. What's that consensus between all the experts in policy and all the experts in the science, and then let's move forward with what we have.
Yeah, I agree with you. And again, I'm just going to plug the Crown Estates work because that's a lot of what they're trying to do. Last question is from Rosamund again, who is saying, talking about other industries, is the decommissioning of oil rigs ever used as compensation? Given the idea of renewable energy is to phase out oil and gas reliance, why aren't we using the oil and gas development areas in the North Sea and replacing those structures with offshore wind farms? They've already been impacted by human development, so surely developing there would be preferable. The decommissioning debate is a massive one that I'm not going to try and cover in 3 or 4 minutes, other than to say that there is lots of work going on in programs like Insight and others. And just to give another plug, there is a program called the Value of Marine Artificial Structures, which NERC released a pre-announcement for, which is looking into this exact question. When you're decommissioning oil and gas structures, you have to balance the OSPAR regulations to take everything out with some of the emerging findings around the ecological value of those structures. And you do kind of get these strange situations sometimes where you've got kittiwake colonies on extant oil and gas structures that then need to be taken out, impacting that kittiwake population. I know that all the people who are responsible in that decision-making process are looking at the new evidence that's coming out and trying to figure out what's the way that we do this in the most sensible way. Those oil and gas structures have liabilities associated with them. Most of them are end of life, and there are big issues around how you hand that liability over to other parties. And there are also issues about whether you can build an offshore wind farm on top of even an empty oil and gas reservoir, because that oil and gas reservoir might be used for carbon capture and storage in the future. So there's like layers of engineering considerations, and then ecological considerations, and then regulatory considerations that need to be taken into account. But I think that idea of looking at areas that have already been impacted and thinking about does that make your new impact any less is definitely one that people are kind of thinking about. Ed, Kim, before we wrap up, is there any comments you've got on either that question or any other?
No, I agree with that. It's always kind of fascinating. I think just again thinking through the need for evidence on those sort of like those structures that are there, those impacts, particularly because some of those structures have got some pretty novel ecosystems around them, and what are the implications of taking that out and so on. Again, it comes down to this bit about a joined up approach, right? So
yeah,
like trying to think through different sort of implications, sectors, everything else, and just trying to bring it together. Hence, in theory, the whole part around sort of marine spatial planning and doing this in the round.
Yeah.
I'd also just point you to the direction of the Insight policy briefs. There's not one on strategic compensation, but it does come up in the marine biodiversity one and the marine net gain policy briefs.
Yes, and Kim, could you put the link to those in the chat, because I think they'd be interesting for people as well.
Yeah, we'll do.
Great, we are coming to a close, so I'd quite like to end on time. The issue of strategic compensation is a really live one. These slides are going to be up online. I would encourage you to go and have a look at the Crown Estate website, their Round 4 website, where they've got the strategic compensation plan for the 2 strategic compensation plans for Round 4 are up there. Have a look at the ECOWind website. ECOWings in particular is developing some interesting work on strategic compensation and has been feeding into some of the options for around birds. and the other projects are also looking at this quite closely as well. So keep an eye on the ECOWind website. And again, the plugs for the things that I've talked about are the Offshore Wind Environmental Evidence Register, which has got a lot of those evidence gaps and relates them back to strategic compensation, is worth having a look at. The Offshore Wind Evidence and Knowledge Hub, which is the Crown Estate's sort of nascent hub. There's not a lot on there at the moment, but it's an initiative that they're setting up that's worth going to have a look at. The ECOWind website, obviously, and the Insight website that Kim has put up has got lots of information around structures in the marine environment as well. So I'd always encourage you to go and have a look at them. We will be putting another one of these on cumulative effects assessment. I'm just going to check my notes again, on the 29th of May, which Ed will be leading. So we look forward to seeing you then. This webinar will be up on the ECOWind website, so please tell your colleagues about it. We'll be sharing the link, I guess, both through the ECOWind newsletter, but also to everyone that registered as well. So thank you for coming along today. We hope you find this useful. And if you have any questions, then yeah, please don't hesitate to get in touch. And yes, we hope you come to the next one. But you have a good rest of the day, and thank you, Ed and Kim, for providing your insights today. It's been really, really great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Cheers.
Thanks, everyone.